Welcome to Indus Special. I'm Ejaz Haider. The 74th session of the United Nations General Assembly opened 2 days ago on Tuesday. The UNGA meets every year in regular session, commencing on the Tuesday of the third week in September, counting from the first week that contains at least one working day. But this year is different. It's not business as usual. Since 5th August, nearly 10 million people, Kashmiris, have been deprived by a right-wing Hindu supremacist Indian government of their basic rights and freedoms. Freedom of movement, expression, assembly, freedom to perform religious rites and rituals, freedom to communicate, have access to education, health facilities, and information. In essence, everything that peoples everywhere take for granted. Let it be iterated that even before 5th August, Kashmiris, since 1947, were deprived of their right to self-determination, to choose their destiny, to be who or what they are or want to be. So the UNGA, if it were to go by its charter and act as the conscience of the world, is meeting this year while a huge tragedy is unfolding before the world's eyes. Genocide Watch has already issued an alert. Thousands of Kashmiris, political leaders, social activists, intellectuals were arrested before 5th August and tourists sent back. They remain incarcerated and hundreds more have been since arrested or detained. According to the BBC, hundreds have been transferred to jails in mainland India. The Supreme Court of India has sought a report from the Jammu and Kashmir High Court Chief Justice on the allegations that people were finding it difficult to approach the Srinagar bench of the High Court. Chief Justice of India Ranjan Gogoi is reported to have said that it was very, very serious if this was the case, as was claimed by a lawyer before the bench. Justice Gogoi also said that he would personally visit Kashmir and assess the situation at the Jammu and Kashmir High Court if needed. Is the UNGA prepared to do what it is supposed to under its own charter and call out India on Delhi's fascist move to deprive Kashmiris of their dignity and basic rights? And more importantly, to enforce its own resolutions on Kashmir. We are joined today to discuss this by Yasir Ahmed Shawl, who's director of South Asia Center for Peace and Human Rights and editor and founder of KashmirInsider.com, joins us from London. We also have with us Fahd Husain, who is executive editor at The Tribune and also director news at Express News. Let me begin with Fahd Husain here. Fahd, this is not business as usual. There are so many warnings, so many alerts being issued. I'll just give you excerpts from an interview that was recently conducted with the editor of Kashmir Times, Anuradha Bhasin, who incidentally is not a Kashmiri Muslim. She is of the Dogra lineage. And she says, the difficulty we are facing, we don't exactly know what is happening in the first place until the journalists manage to sneak in and dig the information out. There is no access to information. There's no means of verifying fake news. The officials who used to brief media off and on, if not daily, are also not ready to speak. They say they're not entitled to release any information. Then, very recently, Mani Shankar Iyer, a former union minister, wrote an open letter to a former Indian Administrative Service officer, Kannan, who resigned. And Mr. Shankar says, but why convert an entire state into a prison without one word of consultation with any of its inhabitants? If it is to save lives, as officially stated, why not co-opt the people whose lives are being saved? So these are voices not just internationally, not just by Pakistan, not just by the Muslims, but also by people with some conscience. And do you think we are prepared to go to the UNGA and actually present the case?
Well, Yasir, I think, as you said very correctly, that the situation on the ground in occupied Kashmir has changed completely since August 5. And in fact, not only the situation on the ground, but also the entire paradigm around the Kashmir issue has changed. So whether we will have anything spectacular to say or anything impactful to say in the UN session, I mean, I remain a bit skeptical. Of course, the Prime Minister has been saying that he's preparing obviously for his speech, and he's got a lot of people working on that speech. But my point is that even if you make a very impressive speech, how does that change the situation on the ground? I think we are at a stage where things have moved beyond just empty rhetoric and speeches, and I think there's something more creative and impactful needs to be done if we want to somehow remain relevant to what is happening and unfolding in occupied Kashmir.
Okay, Fahd, I will come back and ask you a sense of how we can be creative, but let me hop across to Mr. Shawl here. Mr. Shawl, since you obviously look at the situation very closely, you also part of the diaspora, based as you are in London. Are you expecting something from UNGA this year with reference to Kashmir?
Well, to be really, very, very honest, what happened at the Security Council after that, we don't have a lot of expectations, from United Nations, to be really, very honest with you. But I will beg to, disagree with Fahd, what Fahd was saying. I think Pakistan, if you look at the previous governments this time around, 2016 was a very similar situation. So this time around, what has been happening is Pakistan is being very proactive. Yes, I know, as you're saying, a lot, proactive steps needs to be taken. But what can Pakistan do? Do we want them to go to war with India right now? I don't think the situation is, it is that good right now, and Pakistan can take those steps. If you look at the situation in IOK right now, even the collaborators who are part of the Indian machinery, they have even locked them down. Farooq Abdullah, whose father, brought PSA in Kashmir, he has been charged under PSA himself. So just think about the ordinary Kashmiri, what's been happening with ordinary Kashmiri in Kashmir. So situation is really, very grim in Kashmir right now. Yeah.
Mr. Shawl, I'm happy you mentioned PSA, because before this whole thing happened, a lot used to be said about AFSPA, but very few people outside of occupied Kashmir realized that an even more menacing law was the PSA, which, if I remember correctly, was originally brought in to check timber smuggling, but then its ambit was expanded, and most of the political activists and other Kashmiris have been put through the ringer by using this law. It's a deep irony that Mr. Farooq Abdullah has been charged under PSA. I'm sure he must be reflecting on all the agitation that the Kashmiris were doing with reference to this law. And that was, of course, the time when these collaborators, or as I call them, the Quislings, were obviously trying to give some modicum of legitimacy to the Indian rule. But what it actually tells us is that now India does not have anyone in occupied Kashmir actually supporting its move, because even the collaborators are now no more on the scene.
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. And that is what has been happening. As far as PSA and ASPA, these acts go, as far as they are concerned. What has been happening before, like timber smuggling and all that, it was just they just said that they brought it in for that, but it was always to curb the sane voices, in Kashmir, people who always wanted to exercise their free will. It was always for them. And like if you go back into history, that is what they've always done. They've just picked and choose who they want to put behind the bars and who they want to put at the forefront. So that is what has been happening in Kashmir. Yeah, and right now, to your first question, what we should expect from Pakistan is United Nations, European Union, OIC, all these forums. We need very proactive diplomacy right now in all these institutions, so that at least some kind of relief should be given to the Kashmiris, because Kashmiris are suffering right now.
Okay, Fahd, you give me a sense of how we can be creative. And I, by the way, totally agree with you that platitudes, shibboleths, and cliches are not going to cut it. So yes, we do need to be creative. But apart from what has been done so far, writing letters to the foreign ministers, to heads of government and states, going to the OIC, going to the Human Rights Forum of the UN, and now to the UNGA. What can we do that is different?
See, Judge, if I were to take up, what you're saying, I would say that I think we should appreciate the fact that, in this entire situation, the center of gravity is occupied Kashmir itself. I mean, as long as we keep reminding ourselves that is the center of gravity, then anything which needs to be done in order to have an impact has to be linked directly to the center of gravity instead of just working on the periphery. Now, I do believe that there are a number of options between doing nothing or going to war. These are two extremes. Kashmir, I believe, will now be fought on two fronts as far as we are concerned. On the ground in occupied Kashmir, and when I say fought, I don't mean physically fought. I mean in terms of tackling the situation. So what is happening on the ground in occupied Kashmir, and B, in the airwaves and digital spaces, where there is a battle of ideas and narratives. Both these fronts require, I believe, a fresh strategy in light of what's happened since August 5, and I do not see that fresh strategy coming in. I mean, I can say that while the resistance of the Kashmiris to Indian occupation requires close coordination, with the leadership in IAEA.
Okay, so when India tested its nuclear weapons, one of the things that they did was to create what they called a National Security Advisory Board. Now, given the magnitude of this August 5th move, do you think that the government should, and this NSAB that India put together was actually not officials. These were experts from various fields that were brought together, and they were supposed to actually advise the government from different angles. Now, are you suggesting that we should have something akin to that, where there are legal experts, where there are other experts, people who understand Kashmir, its culture, its history, and then people who understand modern digital communication, all of them put together in order for whatever the group decides and how it interacts with the officials, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Ministry of Law, etc., and then for the communication experts to develop a proper communication strategy?
What I'm essentially saying, Ejaz, is that we need to reach the global public opinion with a message that carries our perspective in a language, in a format, and in a content that can actually gain traction. So therefore, in order to move towards that goal, some serious rethink needs to happen in terms of how we can manage to do this. And I believe, and I've been propagating this for a while, that what we actually require now is a strategic communication organization. Whether it is an organization, whether it's a department, whether it's a cell, whatever it is, but we require the Pakistani state to have a professional strategic communication setup at the very highest level, which can actually do all of those things that you're suggesting, bring in all the experts, and then be able to churn out the kind of messaging that can gain traction in this world. That is the key thing, because, everything will start with trying to win the battle of the heart and the mind. That's the first thing. And if you're not doing that, and if you're going back to the arguments that we've been using for the past 50 years, then if those arguments had been so persuasive and impactful, then on August 5, we would have seen a reaction from the world, which we didn't see. So I think we need to realize what our weaknesses are, be honest with ourselves, and start to prepare for this long-haul battle which faces us in terms of Kashmir, with the key thing to remember that the center of gravity is occupied Kashmir, and it is our fundamental duty to do whatever we can to try and help the people there.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. That was Mr. Fahd Husain speaking with us. Back to Mr. Shawl. Mr. Shawl, give me a sense of how the diasporas in North America, the UK, Europe can play a role in this, and how can the Pakistani missions link up with that in order to sort of get a force multiplier effect out of that?
Well, to be really very honest with you, first of all, I would agree with what Fahd has been saying about fresh strategy and narrative. And I think we have a narrative, to be really very honest, and we need to explore it. Like if you go back to Foreign Minister's speech in the United Nations Human Rights Council, where he depicted a very true picture of what was happening in Kashmir, and in its response, India came up with this narrative that Pakistan is epicenter of terrorism. So like that, us Kashmiris and the Pakistani government, they need to come up with a narrative like India is an epicenter of racism and fascism. And, this needs to be propagated around the world. As far as diaspora is concerned, diaspora, they are doing what they can do. If you look at 2019 and what has happened, in August, as far as Kashmir is concerned, there were huge rallies, across UK, because I live in UK, so I can tell you exactly what was happening here. We haven't seen demonstrations of this kind here, like the whole of central London was choco-blocks. There were people everywhere. Diaspora, they can write to their MPs, MEPs. Now UK is coming out of, European Union, 31st of October. So that channel, we'll lose that channel again of MEPs. But like diaspora, what can they do? They can, educate their kids, because the diaspora in the UK, when they came over here, they weren't that educated. They were all workers. Now the young generation here, they lack a lot of basic knowledge of the conflict. So, there needs to be education, they need to be educated about what's happening in Kashmir, the ground realities and all that kind of sort. And I think over here we need to work with all the big institutions, like, who are here, think tanks. That is all that we can do from here. But like, I think, as Fahd said, the epicenter of everything is, ground zero is Srinagar, is the valley. And I think everything should revolve around that. And I think any positive thing is going to come from Kashmir. Kashmiri people are very resilient, and I think they need to continue their struggle. And Pakistan and the diaspora around, we can do proactive diplomacy. That is all I think, we can do.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. That was Mr. Ahmed Shawl speaking with us. Before I take a short break, I'm just going to play a short clip for you, which is not a Pakistani speaking, which is an American speaking. And this is about Houston and why Houston should say adios, Modi, and not say howdy, Modi.
Last month, a white supremacist terrorist murdered 22 people in El Paso, Texas. His evil act was inspired by the murder of 51 people at mosques in Christchurch, New Zealand. That man's evil act was inspired by the murder of 77 people in Norway in 2011. In Norway, terrorist Anders Breivik left a manifesto that describes how he was inspired by other extremist and nationalist groups around the globe. Breivik pointed to the RSS in India. He praised the right-wing Hindu nationalism of the RSS and its goal of making India into a Hindu nation. He praised the RSS for how they dominate the streets and often riot and attack Muslims. He said the goals of white supremacists and the RSS are identical, and that they should learn from each other and cooperate as much as possible. The RSS is a fascist paramilitary founded in 1925, the same year that Hitler published Mein Kampf. The RSS developed with inspiration from the Nazis, and it produced Narendra Modi. In 2002, Modi presided as soldiers of the RSS massacred 2,000 Muslims. They gang-raped women, hacked people to death, burned people alive. Leaders of the pogrom later confessed on camera that Modi sanctioned their violence. For this reason, Modi was banned from entering the USA for 10 years. Today, under Modi's iron-fisted regime, Christians, Dalits, Muslims, Sikhs, and every Hindu who disagrees with the hate, violence, and supremacy of the RSS lives in fear of their lives. Modi's hands are stained with blood. Those who shake his hand in welcome cannot wash their hands of complicity in his crimes. Bishop Desmond Tutu once said, "If you are neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor. So what then if you roll out the red carpet for the oppressor?" The philosopher Plato said, "Silence is consent." So what then if you raise your voice in support of the oppressor? Rather than howdy Modi, the city of Houston ought to be saying adios Modi.
We'll take a short break and return to discuss heightened tensions with Iran following multiple attacks on Saudi oil facilities that knocked out half of the kingdom's oil output. Meanwhile, the International Atomic Energy Agency's 63rd General Conference also opened in Vienna 2 days ago. amid heightened tensions over the Iran nuclear deal. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special. The International Atomic Energy Agency's 63rd General Conference opened in Vienna 2 days ago amid heightened tensions over the Iran nuclear deal. The meeting comes on the heels of two developments: Iran's decision to gradually go back to the pre-deal status, and attacks on Saudi oil facility, which Riyadh says was sponsored by Iran. The kingdom's military spokesperson showed parts of drones and missiles that were used in the multiple attacks and said they had come from the north, essentially dismissing a claim by Houthi rebels that the attacks were launched by them. The US President Donald Trump has said that there are many options available short of a war, even as his Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, during a visit to Jeddah, said it was an act of war. To discuss these events, we are joined by Mr. Hady Amr, who served in the Obama administration as a White House appointee and a senior diplomat. We are also joined by Dr. Cyril Widdershoven, who's a Middle East defense energy analyst and worked for years in the MENA region, and Mr. Foad Izadi, who is an assistant professor at the University of Tehran. Let me kick off with Mr. Amr. Mr. Amr, what is the situation? Let's begin with the IAEA meeting. What are we expecting there?
Look, I think it's an important meeting. It's an important forum. I mean, clearly in the context of the situation in Saudi Arabia and in Iran, we have, we have a situation where the United States President Donald Trump withdrew unilaterally from the what I think, very effective deal that was negotiated between Iran and the United States and other leading world powers. And so, I think it's going to be it's going to be a tense situation there, and it's really it's a situation of the making of this president that really didn't need to be.
Absolutely. Now, here's the thing: the IAEA inspections, and as you know, is under the JCPOA, a very intrusive regime, said Iran was abiding by this. However, as you mentioned, when President Trump walked out of this unilaterally in 2018, last year, Iran has been saying to the other deal partners, well, if you can give us a reprieve from the primary and secondary sanctions regime, then we'll stick to the deal. We have been going by the letter and spirit of it. However, so far, through the instance of what was previously called the utility vehicle, that has not really happened. And so Iran has gradually been saying we're going to go back to the pre-deal status. Now, is the IAEA going to just focus on the deal itself, which is a narrow focus, or take into account the broader aspects of the US withdrawal from JCPOA?
I would expect them to do both in a sense. I would expect them to primarily focus on the deal, but they're doing it in the context of the broader situation, where the United States, and as a former diplomat and speaking from Washington, I will focus on that. Look, the United States, first of all, has scared away all of our allies with sort of the constant chest thumping, who are afraid that we're going to drag them into a war with Iran. So it's impossible for the United States to set up any international coalition or build allies within the JCPOA. And so, I mean, that's really a central thing there, that this president does not even have the credibility among its own allies, even within the United States, to present honest, fact-based evidence. And so it's really difficult, if not impossible, for him now to build a coalition against Iran, even if he wanted to. So, I mean, ironically, this president wanted to be tough on Iran. He, in many ways, he's been tough on the United States by damaging our own credibility and our own ability to form a coalition.
Okay, stay with me. Let me hop over Professor Izadi here. Professor Izadi, what are you expecting from the IAEA meeting and what agenda Iran is taking to the meeting?
Unfortunately, IAEA is a political entity, and sometimes it is under pressure from the United States to do the wrong thing. Beyond the technical aspects that IAEA looks, and they fairly do a good job with technical work, they are sometimes forced by countries like United States to do things that are not in line with the spirit of United Nations and the idea of using UN instruments to put pressure on independent countries is not why the UN was formed.
Professor Izadi, that's something, of course, and I mean, I agree with you about the politicization, but that is something that kind of unfortunately afflicts the entire sort of security architecture of the United Nations, of which the United Nations is a part. But at the IAEA, you also have allies. I mean, the Europeans who are part of who were deal partners are not particularly happy with Mr. Trump walking away from the deal. So you got that space there, and I'm assuming that you will diplomatically use that space to your advantage.
Yes, they are allies that understand the situation that Iran is facing, and if technical aspects are dealt with, Iran, is under non-proliferation treaty, and what Iran has been doing outside the JCPOA is not a violation of its commitments under NPT. So there should not be any problem for Iran at this conference that they have, the IAEA meeting that they have. But as I said, if history is a guide for us, the U.S. has tried to use instruments of power to pressure independent countries, and even European countries are under pressure from the United States to do the wrong thing and do things that are not in line with why we have these organizations. And if IAEA becomes politicized, then yes, Iran may have difficulties there, but it shouldn't. And I'm not expecting any, because as you said, Iran has been following what Iran was supposed to do, and if Iran is going out of the nuclear agreement, it's because Iran cannot unilaterally follow a multilateral agreement. If no one else is following the agreement, Iran cannot.
Absolutely. Okay, before I get to the attacks on the Saudi facility, let me pull in Dr. Widdershoven. Dr. Widdershoven, do you want to say something about what you expect at the IAEA, or should we move on to the oil business?
I think that at present, whatever will be said at the IAEA is not going to make a huge impact, because the things that are going on have already shown that the main issues are not anymore the IAEA or the JCPOA, but the actions in and around.
Okay. Let me get to this attack on the Saudi facility. Mr. Amr, there's a bit of confusion. So Houthis are saying they're claiming responsibility. Satellite imagery and other technical means, including that of the United States, have concluded that the attack came from the north, and that's what the Saudi military spokesperson also said. And therefore they've concluded that it was done by Iran. What is your reading of this?
The problem is that sadly we live in a moment in history where the word of the President of the United States can no longer be trusted. Where half of even leaving alone the international community, half of the American people no longer trust the word of the United States, who is a sort of where major newspapers, the New York Times and the Washington Post, have documented him and his administration as effectively serial liars, that he's up to 12,000 lies. Yeah. So how can somebody whose word cannot even be trusted domestically be trusted on the international stage? And so we are in this situation where, you know, on one sense, it clearly it would make. I mean, this attack came from somewhere. It was, and it very well may have come from the Houthis with backing from Iran. It may have come from missiles. We have no real way of knowing, certainly in this very short time frame, and it will require an investigation far more broad than the United States could.
So again, you seem to suggest
has no credibility. It cannot build a coalition to advocate for this.
Okay, so you seem to suggest that there's a certain degree of haste with which the United States and of course KSA are jumping to conclusions, and you're saying that there should be an investigation. But give me a sense of, let me just quote President Trump here. And after that, give me a sense of how one can actually make sense of President Trump's foreign policy. Now, he said to the reporters with reference to this attack and Iran, and I'm quoting, these are his words, there are many options. There's the ultimate option, and there are options that are a lot less than that, and we'll see. And then he said, I'm saying the ultimate option, meaning go in war. He also said on Twitter that he had ordered the US Treasury to, again, his words, substantially increase sanctions on Iran. Now, Iran already is under a plethora of primary and secondary sanctions, so I don't really know what he means by further tightening or increasing sanctions on Iran. But how does this work? He says lock and loaded. Then he says we're not going to war. Then he says war is one of the options. There's a lot of confusion here.
Yes, and this is how this president operates both domestically and internationally. He likes to talk big. He likes to seem like the tough guy, but he does not like to take tough decisions. I will say, so Donald Trump wants to appear strong in front of the American people. He wants to appear strong on the international stage. The reality is, though, that on the other hand, Donald Trump promised the American people that he was going to get the United States out of the war in Iraq, out of the war in Afghanistan, and not spend further blood and treasure in the Middle East. And so he's in a bit of a bind here on what to do. So I think what he really wants to do is appear tough, but not really take that decisive action. The danger is, if I could just say, that he may find himself stumbling into a situation where he's climbed up on a tree and he has no alternative but to take military action.
Absolutely.
Commitment. So that's the fear.
Yeah, commitment trap. Thank you. That was Mr. Hady Amr speaking with us. Professor Izadi, tell me, the attacks happened. There's no doubt about that. Now, the Houthis claimed responsibility, whereas the Saudis and the Americans are saying that the attacks came from the north, and in other words, that they were directly sponsored by Iran. But and Iran, of course, denies that it was involved in any way. So two questions here. One, if we accept what the Houthis are saying, then obviously there is a link between Iran and the Houthis. And if we take Iran's denial seriously, then the question arises, who exactly attacked the oil facility?
Well, if you have people claiming that they did it, and there are evidence that can show that the Houthis did not commit this act, then the evidence needs to be shown. And if there are ways of verifying those evidence, they should be presented. the idea that the attacks came from north doesn't prove anything. These are drones. Drones are designed to move around.
But apparently, going by the Houthi claim, I mean, if they've got the cruise missiles and if they've got drones that can actually penetrate through the Saudi air defense system and early warning system, then they're not, that sort of deprived of modern weaponry. In the event that there's a miscalculation, and miscalculation, the history of war is replete with such miscalculations. And as President Trump says, the weapons are not just locked and loaded, but they're also released. What are Iran's options?
Well, Iran is an independent country, so attacking Iran would have serious consequences for whoever did the attack. And Iran's military is fully capable. It was a couple of months ago that Iran managed to shoot down the most sophisticated U.S. drone that exists with domestic technology. The vessels that they use were not bought from outside. So this is a message for President Trump that it's not really good for him to have hundreds or thousands of American soldiers dead in an election year. And I think the reason he is trying to refrain from a military confrontation with Iran is realizing that fact. And they are putting a lot of pressure on Iran. They have not allowing Iran to sell oil officially. And this type of activities will have consequences. Iran cannot be watching others to sell oil and be prevented from doing normal international trade.
That's a very important point you have raised. Thank you so much. That's the time I had for this segment. Professor Izadi was speaking with us. It's a very interesting observation that Iran cannot watch others sell oil when it is prevented from selling oil. So, reading between the lines, let's see where the investigation goes. This is all we have from Indus Special today. We shall see you tomorrow. Until then, it's goodbye.